Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to cover 25 decades-old cold cases, which are finally solved after many twists and turns. Welcome to Mysterious 5. Our first case is the case of Mary Agnes Moroney. Mary Agnes Moroney was born on May 10, 1928, and they lived in an apartment over a grocery store at 5200 South Wentworth Avenue. The Moroneys were very poor, as each week, Michael only earned a meager $15 distributing pamphlets. One day, one of Catherine's relatives reached out to a welfare agency, and the details of their dire situation were published in a newspaper. Although the agency usually kept addresses confidential, an unfortunate misstep led to a woman learning of the family's address. One day, a poised and eloquent woman showed up on the couple's doorstep. She introduced herself as Julia Otis and offered assistance in the form of groceries and gifts. At the time, Catherine was just 17 years old and already expecting her third child. Catherine sensed something amiss with the woman, but, desperate for help, she led her into the house where 2-year-old Mary was playing on the floor. The woman's eyes lit up when she spotted Mary and immediately started chatting with her about going on a trip to California. This left Catherine feeling visibly uneasy, so the woman cut the conversation short and departed. Undeterred, the next day she returned with even more gifts for the family. The woman asked Catherine if she could take her daughter shopping for some clothes. It took some convincing, but Catherine reluctantly agreed. With a wiry smile, the woman took young Mary Agnes's hand. Immediately, Mary began having a fit. She did not want to go. Catherine recalled regretting having let Mary go with a stranger as soon as she left, but by then, there was nothing she could do but wait and hope that her daughter would return to her. She never did. Catherine and her husband immediately contacted authorities as they frantically searched for any trace of their daughter. The following day, a letter wrapped in a $5 bill was delivered to them, which stated that Mary Agnes had been taken away to California. The letter was signed by Julia Otis and promised Mary would return within 2 months. Upon examining the letter, authorities found several obvious efforts at illiteracy. Please don't be alarmed. I have taken your little girl to California with me. I have hired a special nurse to care for her. We'll be back in 2 months. By that time, you will be on your feet again and will be able to care for her. She didn't even cry a bit. She is outfitted like a princess. In the meantime, I'll help all I can to get you on your feet. Don't worry about anything else. When you get this letter, we'll be on our way already. As ever, Julia Otis. A second letter soon followed, this time supposedly penned by Julia's cousin, Alice Henderson. This letter revealed that Julia had recently suffered the loss of her beloved child and husband, pushing her into a devastating nervous breakdown. It assured the Moroneys that Mary Agnes would come home eventually. Police conducted an exhaustive search of Chicago's railway terminals, hoping to uncover clues in the case Mary had been taken away on a train, yet all their efforts were unsuccessful. Years went by. Even though she went on to have more children, Catherine remained forever haunted by memories of Mary. From time to time, Mary Agnes's story would resurface in the news, particularly when other children were kidnapped or went missing. 2 decades later, Edan Wright, a writer for the Chicago Daily News, was looking at a family photo of the Moroneys when he noticed something peculiar. All the members of the family resembled each other. Photos of the Moroney family were published in a California newspaper, hoping it would lead to Mary's whereabouts. The photographs were witnessed by a man who swore that one of Mary's sisters looked so much like his wife that it could have been her photograph. His wife was 24-year-old Mary McClellan. McClellan was adopted at an early age. On September 3, 1952, the Chicago Daily News wrote, 22-year search for kidnapped baby ends. The newspaper alleged that McClellan's teeth carried distinctive features that identified her as Mary Agnes. and a reunion was arranged by the newspaper between McClellan and Catherine Moroney. Catherine, however, did not recognize McClellan as her long-lost daughter. "She's a great lady, fantastic person. I wish she was my daughter, but no." What McClellan lacked were two of Mary Agnes's most distinctive features: a strawberry-shaped birthmark on her cheek and an abnormal scar from a protruding navel. Despite this, McClellan developed a tight bond with the Moroney family. Ultimately, a DNA test performed in 2008 following McClellan's death validated Catherine's intuition. McClellan was not her missing daughter. McClellan wasn't the only responder to the photos published by the California newspaper. In fact, a multitude of women reached out to the family, all believing themselves to be Mary Agnes. One woman even signed a photo for one of Mary's brothers as "your sister." Over time, the family lost contact with that woman, but she was located again in 2018. DNA analysis was performed, which confirmed that she was not related to the Moroney family. After an entire century had elapsed, the puzzle of Mary Agnes's fate seemed destined to remain unsolved. Then, miraculously, in February 2023, a genetic analysis made the connection between Mary Agnes's relatives and a Florida woman by the name of Jeanette Burchard. Jeanette passed away in 2003 at the age of 75. Jeanette was adopted. The family who adopted her was informed that she had come into the world on April 14, 1928, and that her biological father had passed away just 2 months afterward. In addition to this, they were told that she spent the initial 6 years of her life in Chicago. Nurtured by her mother, Jeanette Celerek Darris Anderson, and stepfather, Frank Darris, Jeanette, or Mary rather, was raised as a devout Catholic. She was blessed with an exemplary education, never wanted for anything, and knew nothing but love. Mary also had a daughter later in life named Terry Arnold. Arnold claims to recall her grandfather, Frank Darris, revealing to Mary that the woman who raised her all her life was not in fact her birth mother. The comment was never explained or brought up ever again. Arnold also uncovered that her grandmother had a short-lived marriage before marrying Frank Darris. Her grandmother was previously married to a man by the name of John Fahey. According to a 1930 census record, the couple lived together for a while in Chicago alongside Mary. Following her subsequent marriage to Darris, in or around 1934, the woman relocated to Virginia. During World War II, the family relocated again to Florida. In the 1940s, Mary got married to Edward Jennings, Arnold's dad. After Edward died, she got married a second time to Earl Bouchard. Earl also died. Mary had 2 other children in addition to Arnold. She mothered Edward Clifton Jennings Jr. and Barbara Joan Jennings, who died in 2004 and 2006, respectively. She loved us completely. Mary devoted over half a century of her life working as a nurse, according to Arnold. She also adored both cats and dogs and would even have their remains cremated after death in hopes of being buried alongside them after she passed. When Arnold was first made aware of her mother's origins, she said she didn't believe it at first. She noted that her mother lacked Mary Agnes's iconic birthmark and other identifying features. She said she was ready to do a DNA test to prove that the detectives were wrong. Lo and behold, the results were revealed on October 28th, in unveiling a reality far different from what Arnold had come to expect. Since then, Arnold and the Moroneys have been in contact with each other on multiple occasions via phone. Both sides expressed their delight in getting acquainted. Arnold shared photos of her mother with her newfound cousins and remarked that she would have been enthralled to join such a wonderful family. She would have gone to the family and said, "I am here, I'm fine." The Lady of the Dunes. On July 26, 1974, In the Race Point Dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts, a 12-year-old girl, following the persistent barking of her dog, was led to the body of an unidentified woman. The victim was described as having red hair pulled back into a ponytail and secured by an elastic band. The cause of death was later determined to be a fatal blow to the head, estimated to have taken several weeks prior to the discovery of the body. She was discovered lying face down on a beach blanket, with no evidence to suggest any form of struggle before she died. This led investigators to believe that either she knew her assailant or was asleep at the time of her death. Curiously, the sand and beach blanket surrounding the body appeared undisturbed, raising suspicions that the corpse may have been deliberately placed in that location. Although some footprints and tire tracks were found leading away from the crime scene, they weren't of much use to the investigative efforts, primarily due to the loose sand and long passage of time before the gruesome discovery. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding dunes, no other evidence was uncovered in the end. The medical examiner determined that the woman was about 5 feet 6 inches tall. She weighed 145 pounds and had a relatively athletic frame. She had also received costly dental treatment, including crowns valued at $5,000 to $10,000, which would have cost $30,000 to $60,000 in today's dollars. It was noted that both her hands, in addition to some of her teeth, were removed. This led to speculation that the killer was either trying to conceal the victim's identity or their own. Ultimately, with no viable means of identifying her through fingerprints or dental records, the woman's case went cold, and her body was laid to rest in October 1974. She came to be known as the Lady of the Dunes. Over the course of the 48 years following her death, investigators from the Massachusetts State Police and Provincetown Police Department continued to examine countless missing person cases, but no matches were ever found. A facial reconstruction of the woman made out of clay was crafted in 1979. Her remains were also exhumed in 1980 for re-examination, but no new clues surfaced. In March 2000, her body was exhumed once again for DNA testing, but her identity remained a mystery. Then, 10 years later, in May 2010, a CT scan of her skull was conducted, generating images that were subsequently utilized by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to produce another, more accurate facial reconstruction of the woman. In August 2015, there were rumors that the Lady of the Dunes might have appeared as an extra in the 1975 film Jaws, which was filmed between May and October 1974 in Martha's Vineyard, about 100 miles south of Provincetown. During the film's 4th of July beach scene, a woman wearing a blue bandana and jeans, similar to the clothing found on the Lady of the Dunes' body, can be seen among the crowd. While some investigators initially considered this lead, it was later dismissed as wild speculation. Another lead pursued by investigators involved Rory Jean Kissinger, a missing criminal who disappeared in 1973 after breaking out of a Plymouth, Massachusetts jail. Kissinger would have been 25 years old at the time of the murder, having escaped from jail in 1973. Authorities noted a resemblance between her and the unknown victim. However, DNA testing of Kissinger's mother later ruled out any connection between the two. In 2022, the skeletal remains were transferred to Othram, an American corporation specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. A DNA profile was then generated with the hopes of identifying distant relatives and ultimately revealing the victim's identity. On October 31st, 2022, the FBI field office in Boston announced a breakthrough. The long-unknown Lady of the Dunes was finally identified as Ruth Marie Terry, a 38-year-old woman from Whitewell, Tennessee, who had gone missing in 1974. No information regarding potential suspects or the reasons behind Terry's presence in Massachusetts at the time of her murder was disclosed. The FBI confirmed that Terry's identity was established using investigative genealogy, the same method employed to uncover the identity of the infamous Golden State Killer. In late 2022, the Massachusetts State Police launched an investigation into Guy Rockwell Moldavan, Terry's husband, shortly after confirming her identity as the Lady of the Dunes. This wasn't the first time Moldavan had come under suspicion for murder. He was also the primary suspect in the 1950 murder of a bread truck driver and his girlfriend in Eureka, California. In late 1958, Moldavan married a woman by the name of Manzanita Eileen Ryan in Kootenai, Idaho. Manzanita had an 18-year-old daughter from a previous marriage. Both mother and daughter went missing in Seattle on April Fool's Day of 1960, with Moldavan becoming the primary suspect. His wife's body would later be found in their home's septic tank. He fled Seattle, but was arrested by the FBI and charged with evading testimony regarding their deaths, but was never officially charged with their murder. On August 10, 1963, Moldavan got married again in Los Angeles. Later, he faced charges for stealing $10,000 from his new wife's family. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, the sentence was suspended in March 1962 on the condition that Moldavan repaid the money. 11 years afterward, he was working as an antique dealer in Reno, Nevada, when he met and got married to Terry in February 1974. Terry's grandniece talked about how she often noticed a change in Terry's behavior whenever she was with Moldavan, and claimed he displayed possessive tendencies. Shortly after getting married, the couple visited Chattanooga to see Terry's half-brother and his wife. They mentioned plans to travel across the U.S. in search of antiques. As they left, they also expressed their intention to visit Massachusetts, where Terry was murdered. In the late summer of 1974, Moldavan returned to Tennessee in Terry's car and informed her family that she had gone missing from their California home. A private investigator was subsequently hired by the family. He claimed that Terry had sold nearly all her belongings and left willingly, possibly joining a religious cult. For nearly 2 decades, Terry was never heard from by any of her relatives and was listed dead in family obituaries. As for Moldavan, he later moved to a small town near Salinas in 1976 and got married yet again. He retired in 1985 and began hosting a late-night local radio show. He passed away at home in 2002 at age 78 due to an unknown illness. Although still not 100% confirmed, it is widely believed that Moldavan was the one responsible for Terry's murder. As previously mentioned, in addition to being a suspect in the 1960 murders of his former wife and her daughter, evidence on Terry's crime scene suggested there was no sign of a struggle on or near the body, indicating that she likely knew her attacker very well. Nonetheless, with Ruth Marie Terry's fate finally known and her presumed murderer dead, her case was officially closed in mid-2023, and her family can finally know peace. According to the FBI, this was the oldest unidentified homicide victim case in the state of Massachusetts. Cathy Sposito. In the summer of June 1987, Cathy Sposito, an adventurous college student, was relishing the fine weather and enjoying the breathtaking landscapes of Yavapai County, Arizona. Though hailing from Brooklyn, she had journeyed to the opposite side of the country to attend Prescott College. Regularly engaging in mountain biking and leisurely strolls along the vast nearby trails, Cathy was blissfully unaware that her seemingly innocent countryside hikes would end in tragedy. On June 13, 1987, Cathy set out early in the morning on her mountain bike, heading towards Thumb Butte Trail near Prescott. Her plan was to leave her bike at the trailhead and embark on a popular 2.5-mile loop hike. This route would lead her through a majestic pine forest and offer breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. But while on her hike, out of nowhere, she was attacked. A shockingly brutal attack by an unknown assailant ensued, all in a matter of moments. The attacker utilized various weapons, starting with a rock, a wrench, and then ultimately a handgun. A group of hikers further down the trail heard unsettling screams and the sound of gunfire. Despite their best efforts to reach the scene, the challenging terrain prevented them from arriving in time. By the time they got there, Cathy was dead. Cathy Sposito's life ended tragically on the Thumb Butte Trail with no sign of her attacker when the would-be Good Samaritans arrived almost 20 minutes later. The state medical examiner's office determined the cause of death to be severe blunt force trauma. Prescott's local community was shocked by the senseless act, prompting the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office to swiftly investigate. Cathy's friends, who had shared a meal with her the night before, were all questioned. They provided limited information. All they knew was that she had made plans for a solo hike the day before her murder. No one could fathom why anyone would want to harm the 23-year-old student, and investigators struggled to uncover the motive. DNA technology at the time was quite limited, and as time passed, without any eyewitnesses or potential suspects, the case grew colder, leaving many questions unanswered. 3 decades later, in 2017, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office announced they were still looking for the small caliber weapon used in Sposito's murder. It was believed to have been potentially discarded along the path from Thumb Butte Trail to Castle Canyon. But amidst the vast stretches of forest and dense brush, the chances of ever locating the weapon seemed slim to none. In 2022, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office launched a renewed effort to solve Cathy's murder. They unveiled a fresh $10,000 reward, hoping it would yield justice for her killer. Then, in March 2023, 37 years after her tragic demise, a breakthrough emerged. Utilizing recent advancements in DNA technology, scientists were able to link the bloody wrench found on Sposito's crime scene to her killer. At last, they had a name. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Office would finally unveil the identity of Catherine Sposito's murderer. His name was Brian Scott Bennett, a troubled 17-year-old Prescott High School student plagued by mental instability. Bennett was also linked to several other heinous crimes, including sexual assault and abduction. While Sposito may have been his first victim, evidence showed that she was certainly not his last. In April 1990, he viciously assaulted and violated another victim on the same trail and at the same time of day as Sposito. The victim, accompanied by her boyfriend, was camping when she ventured out for a hike on the Thumb Butte Trail. Bennett stealthily approached her from behind, brandishing a rock against her skull. After committing unspeakable things to her, he ran off into the dense wilderness. In July of that same year, he faced accusations of attempted assault after violently attacking a young woman at a house gathering in Chino Valley, Arizona. The victim, under the influence of alcohol, went to a bedroom to lie down. Bennett followed her, locking her in the bedroom before attempting to have his way. Thankfully, some of her friends intervened and managed to break the door down, forcing him to flee. Although later apprehended by the Chino Valley Police Department, conflicting testimonies led to his acquittal. 3 years later, he would target another victim, his fourth, at the Prescott Post Office, menacing her with a knife and subjecting her to multiple assaults. Despite his arrest, insufficient evidence prevented any consequences once again. In 2020, the long-awaited breakthrough in Sposito's case came while detectives were investigating Bennett's second victim. Using familial genealogy, they identified two brothers who were potential suspects, and one of the matches turned out to be Bennett. Unfortunately, Bennett had taken his own life in 1994, 7 years after the assault on Sposito. In November 2022, investigators had his body exhumed to confirm his involvement. The results were conclusive. Bennett's DNA matched the 1990 assault and also matched the DNA found on the wrench used to attack Sposito. It might not undo the atrocious acts committed, but thanks to the tireless efforts of devoted volunteers, diligent investigators, and local law enforcement, 4 families were finally able to find the peace and solace they desperately needed. Ann Campiglia. Ann Campiglia was a bright and ambitious 21-year-old who was determined to make something of herself. She had been accepted into Glassboro State College in New Jersey and was looking forward to pursuing her dreams and furthering her education. However, things took an unexpected turn shortly before she began her freshman year of college. For unknown reasons, she got into drugs and started going through mental turbulence. Consequently, she would often quarrel with her parents and run away from home on numerous occasions. According to her mother, it is uncertain if Holly's drug addiction was the cause or consequence of her emotional turmoil. Altogether, she would escape home a total of 5 times. Her first attempt at running away ended when she was found a month later strolling along Route 70, approximately 1 mile away from her family home on Forest Hill Road near Springdale Road. Every time she returned, her receptiveness to the treatments used to manage her psychological distress would dwindle. On June 10, 1980, while en route to a counseling center, Holly abruptly jumped out of the car driven by her mother. Little did Holly's mother know, this would be their final farewell. She said she wanted to get on with her life. "I want to see the world and do things my way." I tried to pull her back, but the car was on Route 70 near the Sheraton Post, and I couldn't hold on to her. Feeling there was no other option, her mother informed the Cherry Hill Police Department about her daughter's escape. For a month, the family was left in suspense as they anxiously waited for news from the police. Then one day, out of nowhere, a letter arrived. The letter was from Holly. It declared that she was living somewhere alongside 2 other men and suggested that her family should stop thinking about or trying to find her. Attempts to trace back the letter's origin were made, but found it led only to a false street address. All further leads went cold. 1 month later, 2 farmhands were toiling away in a cornfield off Seavers Road outside of Dixon, a small town located just miles from Northern California's state capital of Sacramento. As they went about their regular workday activities, the 2 men made a shocking discovery: the body of a young woman. They immediately notified the police. After a thorough autopsy, it was found that the woman had been fatally injured by multiple bullet wounds on her upper body. Her eyes and hair were brown. She was found to be Caucasian, between 15 to 17 years old, and 5 feet 2 inches tall. She was also described as having a punk rock style haircut. For an entire decade, the woman's identity remained anonymous since police were unable to trace any documents that could shed light on her true identity. As a result, she became known as the Dixon Jane Doe. Then, in 1992, Holly's family discovered that her name had mistakenly been removed from the police database of missing persons. Immediately, they contacted law enforcement and requested for her name to be added back into the system. After some time had passed, the Solano County Police reached out to Holly's parents with the startling revelation. The Dixon Jane Doe they uncovered in August 1980 was indeed their missing daughter. Even though her identity was uncovered, law enforcement still had no leads regarding her killer. Consequently, the investigation grew stagnant yet again. In 2021, Holly's parents implored Solano County investigators to utilize the latest progressions in DNA technology with hopes of uncovering their daughter's murderer. Detectives then submitted a sample of the evidence retrieved from the crime scene for DNA testing, which revealed that it belonged to a male. After the DNA was added to several databases, in late February 2023, a 76-year-old man by the name of Herman Lee Hobbs emerged as the killer. For the majority of his life, Herman had been a threat to public safety through violent criminal behavior. By 1969, more than 12 armed robberies in and around the Sacramento area had already been attributed to him. He was 22 at the time. After a wild car chase, Hobbs was apprehended and acknowledged his involvement in the serial robberies, agreeing to plead guilty. However, when it came time for sentencing in court, the towering 6'5" man tried to make a break for it and had to be tackled by a California Highway Patrol officer. Hobbs' sentence for armed robbery was brief, and by the year 1975, he had his liberty back. He relocated to Rio Linda, a block away where a 13-year-old girl by the name of Terry Pata lived. On a cold January day, Pata decided to take an early leave from her junior high due to a throbbing headache. She never returned home. 9 days afterward, her lifeless body was discovered in a nearby drain pipe. She had been murdered and violated. In 2000, a Yuba County court found Hobbs guilty of a similar crime. The victim was a 15-year-old girl. Prior to his detainment, Hobbs' own daughter and niece testified that he was liable for the slayings of multiple children. This information drove detectives to re-examine Terry Pata's. A DNA test using samples found at the crime scene yielded a perfect match with Hobbs' own genetic material. With an already lengthy jail sentence, Hobbs pleaded no contest and was given a second sentence of 25 years to life. These crimes were only the tip of the iceberg. That same year, loggers stumbled upon the skull of a woman in Yuba County's foothills, which DNA testing then revealed to be that of a 29-year-old Brenda Ann Tucker. Brenda had gone missing from her Oroville residence 6 years prior. Her family was well acquainted with Hobbs. In fact, he was a frequent overnight guest at their home during the 90s. Taking into account Hobbs' violent past, he was accused of Brenda's murder. However, a judge dismissed the charges in 2002 due to insufficient evidence. After the genetic material taken from Hobbs matched with that found on Holly's body, a Solano Superior Court judge issued an arrest warrant for him to be transferred from Valley State Prison in Chowchilla to the Solano County Jail. In late February 2023, Hobbs was booked into jail and is now facing criminal charges for murder and illegal use of a firearm. Working together with other Northern California law enforcement agencies, Solano County Sheriff's detectives are striving to establish a connection between Hobbs and other unresolved murders in the region. Vickie Lynn Belk. Vickie Lynn Belk was born March 20th, 1951, was the eldest of 5 other siblings. Vickie and her sister were among the first African-American students to enroll at Minnie Howard Elementary School in Alexandria, Virginia. This landmark achievement came after her parents won a civil rights lawsuit, compelling Virginia to comply with the Supreme Court's ruling on school desegregation. Vickie excelled academically and became the first college graduate in her family. In 1979, her future looked more promising than ever. She was thriving as a management analyst at the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. But on August 27, 1979, tragedy struck. While leaving work, Vickie was kidnapped by an unknown assailant. She was assaulted and fatally shot. Her boyfriend reported her missing the following day. Because she was an adult, Vickie's family was told they had to wait 3 full days before filing a missing persons report for her, despite their concerns. Suffice to say, the following 2 days were filled with excruciating anxiety, and as time passed with no one hearing anything from Vickie, the family became more and more worried that something gravely wrong had happened. On August 29, 1979, the Charles County Sheriff's Office contacted Belk's family. Her family was told there was new information about Vickie and asked to visit the police department. At that moment, Vickie's parents held onto hope. However, upon arriving at the sheriff's office, they were met with devastating news. Their firstborn, their eldest daughter, had been murdered and abandoned on the roadside. Vickie's body was discovered by a teenager in a wooded area near Metropolitan Church Road and Route 227 in Charles County, Maryland. The boy immediately went home and informed his mother, who contacted the police. Vickie Belk's death was ruled a homicide. Vickie's mom was devastated. She couldn't fathom how someone would murder her eldest child. Investigators worked diligently to secure the crime scene, gathering evidence and searching for clues. They conducted numerous interviews, followed multiple leads, and performed forensic analysis on various items found at the scene. But due to technological limitations at that time, progress in Belk's murder case was eventually stalled. Despite the extensive efforts of the police investigators, the case gradually grew cold over the years. As forensic technology continued to progress, investigators kept re-examining the evidence found on the crime scene, hoping for a breakthrough. In early 2022, detectives initiated efforts to re-examine the case using advanced forensic technology that was unavailable over 4 decades ago when the murder occurred. They analyzed DNA from minute traces of bodily fluids found on Belk's dress and slip. Subsequently, a profile was created and entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a national DNA database. In November 2022, the police received confirmation of a DNA match. The DNA match identified Andre Taylor as the killer. Police investigators immediately began looking into Taylor's background and his ties to Bryant's Road, Maryland. It was discovered that Taylor had previous arrests for violent crimes in the D.C. area. Records showed that in the 1980s, he lived on Bryant's Road, just 4 miles from where Belk's body was found. After identifying Taylor, investigators began the effort to try and find him. There was a problem, though. Since 2019, he did not have a known address. Detectives collaborated with law enforcement partners, including the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department Homicide, United States Homeland Security Investigations, and the U.S. Secret Service Baltimore Field Office. Thanks to their help, a search warrant was obtained for Taylor's DNA. After months of searching, investigators were finally able to track him down. He was living in a rundown apartment in Washington, D.C. On June 16th, the Charles County State's Attorney's Office presented the case to a Charles County grand jury. As a result, Taylor was indicted on charges. On June 22nd, he was arrested and taken to a detention center in Washington, D.C. Following this, on June 27th, he voluntarily waived extradition and was then transported to the Charles County Detention Center, where he was officially charged. According to the Charles County Sheriff's Office, Taylor, who is now 62 years old, was only 18 years old when he murdered Belk. There is no evidence suggesting any connection or familiarity between him and Vickie. A press conference announcing Taylor's arrest was held, attended by several of her family members. 51-year-old Lamont Belk, the sole child of Vickie, who was 7 years old at the time of her tragic murder, delivered a poignant speech during the press conference. I just thank God for allowing us to be alive to bear witness to this momentous occasion. Our community is a little bit safer today with this person behind bars. To honor Vickie Lynn Belk's memory, her family established the Vickie Belk Scholarship Foundation to provide scholarships in her honor. Christina Castiglione. Christina Castiglione was a 19-year-old girl who lived in Redford, Michigan with her parents. She went to Redford Union High School, where she not only excelled academically, but also made remarkable feats on the playing field as well. Just after graduating, she landed a job as a clerk in the research department at Detroit Edison Company. She had also contacted an Army recruiter to explore enlisting in the military. On March 19, 1983, Christina was given the day off and used it to lend her mother a hand by running errands alongside her boyfriend. As the sun set, her boyfriend told her he needed to go and promised to join her later that night. As time dragged on with no word from her boyfriend, Christina's anxiety grew. Ultimately, she went out into the night in search of him. She arrived at her boyfriend's house, where his sister informed her that he wasn't home. She then trekked a mile down 5 Mile Road until she reached the residence of one of her friends. After coming to the realization that her boyfriend was not present at her friend's place either, Christina stayed and watched TV for some time before deciding to return home. Little did she know it would be the last journey of her life. On March 21, 1983, Christina's mother reported her missing after she didn't return home. 8 days later, the Livingston County Sheriff's Office was informed of a dead body that had been discovered in the Oak Grove State Game Area on Fawcett Road in Deerfield Township. As deputies arrived on the scene, they stumbled upon Christina's body, partially clothed and lying in a remote wooded area. Christina's body indicated that she had been viciously assaulted. During the autopsy, it was determined that strangulation was the cause of death. Additionally, traces of DNA believed to have belonged to a male were discovered. Unfortunately, due to how limited DNA technology was at the time, a suspect was never apprehended. Her boyfriend and his friends told police they were driving to a party the night she disappeared at around 8 p.m. when they saw her walking. Her boyfriend, however, was conscious that his girlfriend wasn't very fond of his friends, so he elected not to ask them to pick her up. When his friend stopped at a store to purchase some supplies for the party, he left the vehicle and decided to wait nearby until Christina caught up. When she didn't show, he wandered back in search of her, but she was nowhere to be found. He then attempted to call her home numerous times, yet no one picked up. According to Redford's chief of police, Christina was last spotted hitchhiking at approximately 8:30 p.m. along 5 Mile Road, west of Telegraph in Lola Valley. The person responsible for discovering Christina's body became the primary suspect due to some inconsistencies in his statements. Initially, the man alleged that he discovered the body by chance while deer hunting, even though he was not in possession of any hunting gear. He also said that he had only seen the body from afar and stayed at least 100 feet away, but that was later proven to be a lie. Despite agreeing to take a polygraph, the man neglected to appear at the arranged time. The man would also lie several times during the interviews, but as there was no evidence connecting him to the crime and no prior convictions, law enforcement officers were unable to place him under arrest. After an extensive investigation, not a single person connected to Christina was found liable. More than 25 polygraph tests were administered on everyone who may have had something to do with her disappearance, most of whom passed or had solid alibis for their whereabouts at the time of her disappearance. With all potential suspects, evidence, and leads exhausted, Christina's case went cold. In the early 2000s, the Michigan State Police Crime Lab entered samples of the DNA retrieved from the crime scene into the combined DNA index systems, but no matches were found. More than 2 decades later, on March of 2022, the Livingston County Cold Case Team applied for and successfully obtained grant funding to conduct advanced DNA testing on the evidence gathered in 1983. Funding was granted by Season of Justice, a charitable organization committed to providing financial support for DNA testing on unsolved homicides. The organization furnishes financial aid to police departments across the country so that they can perform sophisticated DNA testing on homicide cases, assault incidences, and Jane/John Doe scenarios in which DNA is the only investigative option. After 2 months, Othram Incorporated, a reputable forensic laboratory in Texas, was entrusted with the case's genetic material for further examination. Othram experts leveraged forensic-grade genome sequencing to establish a comprehensive genealogical profile from the unknown male suspect's DNA. Then, almost 4 decades since Christina's tragic death, a likely suspect was identified. It was a man by the name of Charles David Shaw. His identity was confirmed through 3 separate familial DNA comparison tests. According to Shaw's family, the 26-year-old's life was desperately troubled by his sexual addiction and mental health issues. This resulted in him having a long history of run-ins with the law, starting at an early age. In 1973, his first brush with crime was over a breaking and entering charge in Livonia. Then 4 years later, he was taken into custody for drug possession. In 1981, he was also apprehended in a Fowlerville McDonald's parking lot for attempting to kidnap a woman. He pleaded guilty and served 2 weeks in jail before being placed on probation. In 1982, he was rearrested for stealing women's shoes from a local Kmart. After working together with the relatives of Shaw, it was discovered that he had been an inhabitant of Livonia for a long time and lived within 5 miles from where Christina disappeared. Despite their best efforts, detectives were unable to uncover any concrete connection between Christina and Charles Shaw that could explain why she was targeted. His ex stated that he suffered from doubts regarding his gender identity. Shortly before his death, he also expressed his desire to undergo gender reassignment surgery. Sadly, Shaw would never face punishment for his crime, as on November 27, 1983, it was discovered that he had passed away in Detroit due to autoerotic asphyxiation. At a press conference held in February of 2023, Christina Castiglione's case was officially closed. Unfortunately, her parents were not present at the conference as they had tragically passed away without ever discovering who was responsible for the heartbreaking loss of their daughter. Angela Wilds. On June 4, 2006, 2 hikers stumbled upon a woman's body in the South St. Vrain Canyon near Lyons within unincorporated Boulder County. According to investigators, she was naked except for a cross ring on her left hand. It seemed as though she had been buried and then pulled out of her shallow grave by some large animal. Near the grave, deputies discovered a sleeping bag and a pillow in a neatly folded pillowcase alongside a pair of yellow ski pants. Owing to her body's state of decomposition, investigators were unable to identify the woman or determine the cause of death. Despite this, foul play was expected due to the fact that her body had been buried. What was even more peculiar, however, is that there were no gunshot wounds, broken bones, or stab wounds to indicate homicide. The coroner speculated that strangulation could have been the cause of death, yet was unable to give a definitive answer. Approximately 50 pounds of quicklime was discovered on and around the gravesite, in addition to being found on the corpse. Going back as far as 1200 BC, quicklime, a white powdery mixture of calcium oxide, had been used in wars, mass burials, and today by modern criminals for its purported ability to accelerate the decomposition of corpses. With nothing to go on, the sheriff's office implored the public to provide any tips they may have in an effort to identify the victim. Numerous leads were followed up on, including reports of missing women from across the country, but nothing could point to the woman's real identity. In the month of October 2006, the sheriff's office was informed about a woman wishing to report her friend missing. Her friend's name was Angela Wilds. She informed Longmont Police Department officers that she was worried something bad might have happened. The friend painted a vivid picture of her physical features, which strongly resembled the body found in the canyon. Additionally, they mentioned a ring Angela often wore, which was similar to the ring discovered on a woman's body. In November of 2006, the sheriff's office conducted a thorough DNA test to compare 4 samples from Angela Wilds' sisters with DNA taken from the unidentified body's rib bones. The results revealed, without a shadow of a doubt, that the mysterious woman was, in fact, none other than 38-year-old Angela Wilds. Angela was last seen on April 2006. Angela hailed from Longmont, Colorado. She had no place to call home or any dependable source of income. To make ends meet, she relied on the hospitality of friends and often had to sleep on their sofas. As their search for answers continued, investigators conducted interviews with Angela's family members, friends, and associates. Unfortunately, they were unable to get to the bottom of what might have happened to her. After careful examination, the DNA found on Angela Wilds' ski pants was identified as hers. However, there were additional traces of an unidentified male's genetic material discovered on the sleeping bag and pillowcase found near her body. On January 22, 2009, the unknown DNA was revealed to have belonged to a man by the name of John Angerer. DNA also showed Angerer had slept with Wilds before she died. According to his family, Angerer was a regular at the South St. Vrain cave, often going on trekking and camping trips around it. His sister even remembers dropping him off at the exact spot where Angela's body was later discovered. Utilizing both Angela and Angerer's names, investigators began to explore any potential links between the two. They found that numerous people had witnessed the two of them socializing from late 2005 through early 2006. Friends also saw Angerer hugging and kissing Angela at a Longmont barbecue in early 2006. In 2009, Angerer was interviewed 2 separate times by the Anchorage Police Department and Boulder County Sheriff's Office. In both interviews, Angerer stated that in early 2006, he attended a dive school in Texas and then moved to Colorado, settling down in Canyon City, Longmont, and Mount Vista before moving to Alaska in August. When confronted with Angela's photo, he informed officers that he didn't know who she was, nor was he familiar with a woman by the name of Angela. He also adamantly refuted any notion that he had been camping in the South St. Vrain Canyon at the time of the crime. After meticulously compiling information and evidence, investigators drafted an arrest warrant for Angerer, which was quickly authorized by a judge. In 2010, he was apprehended and officially charged with the murder of Angela Wild. Angerer was arrested in Alaska, where he was in custody on a probation violation and extradited to Colorado. His preliminary hearing was held on July 12th of 2010. Angerer would spend 5 months in jail before a judge dismissed his case due to insufficient evidence. The reason for the dismissal was that, at Angerer's probable cause hearing, the Boulder County Coroner's Office chief pathologist testified that there was no evidence in Wild's autopsy pointing to a homicide. Furthermore, at the time of her passing, Wilds was afflicted with a blocked artery that the pathologist hypothesized may have caused an abrupt cardiac arrest. They need to produce evidence first that Angerer is the person who caused the death of another, said Angerer's public defender. Following the preliminary hearing, some of those acquainted with Angerer stepped forward, declaring him to be highly volatile. A witness even reported seeing him attempted to choke one of his past girlfriends. In the following years, the Boulder County Sheriff's Office and District Attorney's Office, aided by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, toiled relentlessly on this case, interviewing fresh witnesses and conversing with forensic pathologists for further insights. This included several of Angerer's prior romantic partners, who described him as a dangerously jealous and possessive individual. They had also experienced him trying to strangle them on multiple occasions. Testimony from one witness indicated that Angela's name, among other female names, had the power to invoke a deep and intense rage in Angerer. In 2015, a pathologist reviewed Angela's case and concluded that Angela's cause of death was homicidal violence. However, they were still not able to pinpoint the exact cause. The pathologist factored in the investigative discoveries, such as that Angela was discovered in a secluded wooded area without clothing and covered with lime powder. They then inferred that an asphyxiation event was probably what had occurred. At the time this hypothesis was made, the pathologist was unaware that John Angerer had been previously accused of strangulation. A particular ex of Angerer's also stepped forward, providing a wealth of much-needed information to the investigators. In the year 2009, she had testified that Angerer never choked her. However, 14 years later in 2023, she would backpedal on that statement, informing investigators that during their relationship, Angerer tried choking her multiple times. She also stated that when Angerer was under the influence of drugs and alcohol, his behavior became increasingly unpredictable and frightening. In December of 2022, two more potential witnesses told the police that they had witnessed Angerer and Angela together in a motel located 10 miles away from South St. Vrain Canyon, where Angela's body was found. After scouring the motel's registry, law enforcement discovered that Angela and Angerer booked a room there between December 26th of 2005 to January 4th of 2006. Investigators took this new, compelling evidence and presented it to a grand jury. On February 16th, 2023, that grand jury brought forth an indictment for second-degree murder. Subsequently, Angerer was apprehended in Alaska on March 9th of 2023. His bond was set at $1 million. I am proud that our detectives didn't give up on this cold case, said Boulder County Sheriff Curtis Johnson. We know Angela's family has been waiting a long time for this day to come, and her family is in our thoughts as we take the next steps in the judicial process. The Sweet Potato Murder. On February 27, 2011, Todd Lampley, a 31-year-old man, was shot through the bedroom window of his Hyannis, Massachusetts home. He had been living in a yellow duplex located at 42 Fresh Holes Road. When responding police officers arrived on the scene, it was too late. He had already passed away. Lampley was originally from Mississippi, and he had 2 daughters. His death marked the first homicide case in Cape Cod that year. It was also the second shooting incident in Hyannis. While investigating the crime scene, authorities recovered 3 pieces of evidence. These included 3 spent shell casings, a black cell phone, and one intriguing element, a sweet potato with a hole in the middle. The prosecutors from the Cape and Islands District Attorney's Office believed that the sweet potato might have been utilized as a makeshift silencer. Regrettably, the phone provided no immediate tangible or forensic evidence. It was, however, registered under the name of Marlo Stanfield, a name that might sound familiar to fans of the renowned HBO TV series The Wire as one of its central characters. It did take more than a decade before detectives caught on to the reference, but once they did, the mutilated sweet potato found at the scene became the centerpiece of their investigation. In an episode of The Wire, there is a scene where a character uses a sweet potato as a makeshift silencer. After the episode aired, many fans became curious about whether this method actually worked in real life. Some people even recorded themselves attempting to use sweet potatoes as silencers and shared their videos on the internet. Based on the assumption the potato might point to whomever committed the murder, it was looked at more closely and tested for DNA. The DNA sample was later verified as a positive match for a certain individual by the name of Devarius Hampton. Hampton was a 40-year-old resident of Mashpee. 12 years after Todd Lampley's death on February 27, 2023, Hampton was apprehended and charged with murder, assault, and battery with a deadly weapon. The reason behind the 12-year delay in his arrest was not specified. Hampton entered a plea of not guilty and was detained without bail. In court, Assistant DA Jessica Alumba presented additional evidence linking Hampton to the crime scene. The police were able to track his movements during that time as he was wearing a GPS monitor due to his involvement in another crime. The GPS tracker indicated that Hampton was indeed present at Lampley's house on the fateful night. Additionally, it revealed that he had later visited the same lake where the firearm used in the crime had been discarded. Some civilians were able to recover said weapon from the lake and hand it over to the authorities. Upon examining the gun, the police were able to confirm that it was, in fact, the very same firearm used in Lampley's murder, as it still contained live bullets. Although they were well aware that both men knew each other, authorities have been unable to determine Hampton's motive in the murder. All they knew was that, in 2010, Hampton testified in court against Todd Lampley, claiming that Todd had fatally shot an 18-year-old by the name of Jaquez Sellers back in 2007. Similar to Lampley, Sellers was killed when a stray bullet pierced the window of his Hyannis home. Lampley happened to reside just down the street from Sellers, and Hampton informed the jurors how Lampley had allegedly confessed to his involvement in the shooting shortly after it took place. One of the suspects in the shooting, Anthony Russ, was acquitted, while the other suspect, Julian Green, was charged with second-degree murder. It's worth noting that Lampley vehemently denied any involvement in Sellers' murder during Julian Green's trial and was never charged with the crime. Keysha Brown. On an October day in 2004, the lifeless body of 28-year-old Keysha Brown was discovered submerged in the bathtub of her 700 East Flamingo Road apartment. Autopsy reports confirmed that Keysha had been assaulted and murdered by an unidentified assailant. Witnesses interviewed at the time provided a description of a man seen entering and leaving the apartment. He drove a red sedan, went inside her home, then exited carrying a duffel bag. Unfortunately, detectives were unable to pinpoint his identity. Even though forensic evidence was collected from the crime scene, investigators were unable to zero in on a suspect. In August 2022, homicide detective Dan Long reviewed Keysha's case and demanded further DNA testing on the evidence found during her autopsy. As he continued to work through it all, Long began noticing a lot of similarities between Keysha's case and other cases he worked on back in 2005. While examining these cases, a sinister pattern began to unfold. All the victims had been assaulted and murdered in a similar fashion, their bodies arranged in an eerie similarity. Instantly, Detective Long suspected he was dealing with yet another homicide involving none other than Norman Flowers. In October 2008, Flowers was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the 2005 murder of 18-year-old Sheila Quarles, who was his ex-girlfriend's daughter. Prior to murdering Quarles, Flowers was no stranger to spending time behind bars. In fact, he had already been incarcerated and paroled twice. He was only out of prison for a mere 20 days when he committed this crime. Then, in 2011, Flowers faced additional first-degree murder charges for the brutal slaying of Marlee Coote, 45, and Rita Gonzalez, 24. The body of Marlee Coote was discovered on May 3, 2005, in her Russell Road apartment. Evidence indicated that she had been assaulted prior to her death, and Flowers' DNA was found all over the crime scene. In the same apartment complex, the lifeless body of Rita Gonzalez was discovered 8 hours later. She had been murdered with a telephone cord. Authorities speculate that Brown was the first of Flowers' victims and that the other 3 women were killed in early 2005. To avoid the death penalty, Flowers agreed to an Alford plea in 2011, which meant that he maintained his innocence but acknowledged the fact that prosecutors could prove their case against him. In return, prosecutors consented to 2 consecutive life imprisonment sentences without the possibility of parole. I would say by definition, he does meet the definition of a serial killer, Lieutenant Jason Johansson of the Metropolitan Police Department said. On February 2023, an arrest warrant for Flowers was issued on charges of assault with a deadly weapon and open murder. He is currently awaiting trial at High Desert State Prison, where he is serving 3 life sentences. Keysha Brown, Keysha's daughter, stated that she suffered for a long time, not knowing what had become of her mother. She expressed her appreciation and gratitude towards the police department, as they undoubtedly worked tirelessly to bring justice to her mother's murderer. The case of Mary Mathis Davis. In the spring of 1987, Mary Mathis Davis, a 29-year-old woman, was employed at Lanier Hardware in Lexington. On May 30th, after completing her morning shift, she went outside for her usual lunch break, but she never returned. The following day, Mary's lifeless body was discovered behind a former Winn-Dixie grocery store, approximately a 20-minute walk from her workplace. She had been assaulted and strangled. During that time, forensic technology was still in its early stages, and there were limited leads for the homicide investigation to follow up on. Nonetheless, crime scene technicians made the conscious decision to meticulously collect and preserve almost every item they could find at the crime scene, even though it seemed pointless at the time. This decision would ultimately prove crucial in solving the case. Lexington Police Chief Robbie Rumage explained that the evidence initially didn't serve much purpose, but the wisdom of preserving it is why they have made progress in the case. The evidence became viable recently thanks to advancements in DNA testing techniques. In early 2023, the Lexington Police Department announced that the evidence collected from the crime scene was re-examined using modern DNA analysis, has identified Russell Grant Wood of Lexington as the main suspect in Mary Davis's murder. Wood was 32 years old at the time of the murder, and it is believed that he had some connection to the victim, although the nature of their relationship remains unconfirmed. Even before this DNA evidence came out, Wood had been identified as a potential suspect, but detectives lacked sufficient concrete proof to substantiate his guilt or establish a motive. Sadly, Wood could not be formally prosecuted as he passed away in 2013. Lexington authorities stated that the new evidence would have been sufficient to charge him for the crime. Mary's niece, Lori Martin, expressed gratitude towards the investigators who persevered in solving the case. She shared that finding the person responsible for Mary's violent murder was a long-awaited prayer answered. Though it cannot bring Mary back, the new developments provide a sense of closure to the family. Lori described Mary as a light in this world, a loving mother, sister, wife, aunt, and friend. The family held a celebration of Mary's life on February 12, 2023, which would have been her 65th birthday. Thanks to the dedication of detectives and diligent work by forensic scientists, this murder case is no longer cold, and Mary's soul can at last know peace. William Arnold Newton. William Arnold Newton was born in the bustling city of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. He began his educational journey there and enjoyed learning from the warm atmosphere until 1979, when his family moved to Ladysmith, Wisconsin. In 1980, after Newton's freshman year of high school had finished, he and his mother relocated to Oklahoma City. Newton's father, Richard Harriman, described his son as a very intelligent young man. He had a lot of things going his way the last year or two. He was just starting to make a life for himself. However, Richard further mentioned that his son had his struggles, describing him as a restless kid who had been perpetually searching for his own identity. Eager to see the world and explore beyond the bounds of California, Newton took off at age 16 and traveled the United States for 3 full years before ultimately settling in Los Angeles in 1985. During his stay in Los Angeles, he found a job working at the Hollywood Spa, a gay bathhouse. Whilst working there, Newton encountered David Ray, an adult film producer who offered him the chance to star in several gay adult videos. Eventually, Newton and Ray developed a romance, which resulted in the formation of London Ray Productions in 1987. Working under the pseudonym Bill E. London, Newton's job at London Ray was simple. He was the movie producer, makeup artist, and set designer. By fall of 1990, Newton had decided to depart from Los Angeles and relocate to Las Vegas. Sadly, fate had something else in store for him. Newton was killed shortly after wrapping up production on what would have been his final movie, The Grip of Passion. He was last seen at Rage nightclub in West Hollywood. The day after the murder, a passerby stumbled upon Newton's body in a dumpster close to Santa Monica Boulevard. At the time of his death, Detective Ron Veneman stated that authorities were pursuing several promising leads but had not yet found anything solid. Furthermore, he mentioned they held other confidential information which could not be disclosed at this point in time. Despite the police's best efforts, Newton's case went on to become unsolved for many years. In 2005, Detective Wendy Berndt declared that she would be revisiting William's case with the hope of technological advances facilitating a break in the investigation. Berndt was an integral part of the investigation into William's case when it first began, but as the years went by and progress came to a sudden halt, she had been moved to different departments. When Berndt took the helm of Hollywood's LAPD homicide unit, she put forth a tremendous amount of effort to make sure that the media was aware of the Newton murder. On the 15th anniversary of Newton's passing, Fox 11 journalist Tony Valdez met up with Berndt and visited the site where the horrendous crime took place. However, in December 2006, journalist Mickey Ski reported that Newton's dad had reached out to him and revealed that the Los Angeles Police Department put the investigation into his son's homicide on hold. In 2020, New York Times best-selling authors Christopher Rice and Eric Shaw Quinn revisited this chilling case on episode 37 of their podcast, TDPS Presents Christopher and Eric, to uncover more details about this tragic event. They created an email address devoted to any tips or information regarding the 30-year-old case. On their 48th podcast installment, they unveiled an account of a potential eyewitness who claimed they were among the last to see William Newton alive before his death. This eyewitness recalled seeing Newton leaving the nightclub in the company of a man bearing a strong resemblance to notorious serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who was apprehended a year later for committing multiple murders, many of which targeting gay men in Milwaukee. At the start of 2021, an LAPD homicide detective in charge of Newton's case reached out to Rice and Quinn due to the success of their podcast concerning this crime. On February 2021, a new episode of the podcast was aired featuring an exclusive interview with the detective who inherited this particular case. Although many authors, filmmakers, podcasters, and self-styled detectives have sought to uncover the truth of Newton's death, the true identity of the person responsible for his death remained a mystery. Or at least that was the case until February 7th, 2023, when the Los Angeles Police Department made a shocking announcement. William Newton's killer was at last identified. Unlike what everyone had thought, it wasn't Jeffrey Dahmer. The murderer's name was Darylyn Madden, a former neo-Nazi white supremacist that previously went by the name Daryl and now identifies as a Jewish woman. As reported by the Los Angeles Times, Newton's murder was a robbery gone wrong. This is how it went down, according to Darylyn. On the evening of October 29, 1990, Darylyn approached Newton with the intent of robbing him. With a serene voice, she warned Newton that he was going to get robbed, abducted, and possibly suffer physical harm, but would remain alive if he kept quiet and avoid drawing attention. Unfortunately, this story was all a ruse. The coroner at the time would later confirm that Darylyn strangled Newton to death and then proceeded to violate his body in a horrific fashion. Investigators were able to uncover the truth behind Newton's murder after Darylyn pleaded guilty to killing a gay man in Oklahoma named Stephen Domer and another man named Bradley Quayles, who was Darylyn's accomplice in Stephen's murder. Ironically, Madden herself was a former gay adult actor named Billy Houston in the early 90s. At one point, she even shaved off both eyebrows and tattooed the words skin and head. According to criminal psychologists, Darylyn's cold-blooded killing of Newton likely stemmed from her own self-loathing, considering she was once involved in the gay adult industry as well. Despite a damning confession, Darylyn, at least for now, will remain free of criminal charges as county officials deemed available evidence insufficient to secure a guilty verdict. Darylyn has also refrained from answering particular questions regarding the case, likely in order to avoid incriminating any potential accomplices. "I may be a murderer, but I'm not a snitch," she said. In the end, the Los Angeles Police Department's Robbery and Homicide Division decided to close William Newton's case as they now had reason to believe William's murderer is under custody. If there's any silver lining to this story, it's that, at the very least, after 3 decades of uncertainty and torment for William's family, they can finally find solace in knowing that his killer is behind bars and can never harm anyone the way he harmed William ever again. Rita Curran. In the summer of 1971, Rita Curran had just taken her first steps towards independence. She moved out of her parents' house into an apartment on Brooks Avenue in Burlington, Vermont. Although unfamiliar with all 3 roommates that resided there, the 24-year-old was determined to start anew and began graduate courses at the University of Vermont while also working as a maid at a local motel. On top of all that, 24-year-old Rita was also employed as a 2nd grade school teacher. On the morning of July 20th, 1971, Rita's roommate made a gruesome discovery. Rita was lying lifelessly on the floor of their apartment. The Burlington police soon arrived and began uncovering the traumatic details surrounding her untimely death. She had suffered a violent assault that caused extensive bruising all over her body. Curran's motel was located close to the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, the birthplace of notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. As certain similarities between her death and previously known crime scenes linked to Bundy were identified by retired FBI agent John Bassett, Curran's sister sent a telegram directly to Florida's death row, inquiring as to his possible involvement in her sister's death. In response to the inquiry, the FBI reported that Bundy had refused to admit or deny his involvement. Although municipal records indicated someone with the name Bundy was attacked by a dog during that week, there was no substantial evidence confirming his presence in Burlington on the exact date. Bundy was interrogated by detectives and eventually let on that he did recall having murdered a young Burlington woman in 1971. Yet, on January 22, 1989, the day prior to his execution date, Bundy, when questioned about the Curran case in particular, denied any and all involvement. At the crime scene, law enforcement officers had gathered evidence that included a lone cigarette butt, which was found near Rita's arm. Unfortunately, DNA technology at the time was limited, and so, even with the murderer's DNA likely on that cigarette, they could not be identified. Some of Rita's neighbors in the apartment building were questioned. A married couple living 2 floors above Curran's when she was killed was also interviewed as part of the investigation. William DeRoos, who had a criminal record, attested that he and his wife Michelle were in their apartment all night long. They told officers that they had not heard or seen anything suspicious. Ultimately, no likely suspect was found by the police despite their best efforts. With no new evidence, witnesses, or suspects coming up, Rita Curran's case ultimately went cold. But then, in 2014, 43 years after the murder, the Burlington Police Department requested further DNA analysis of all evidence collected at the crime scene, including the cigarette butt. Despite managing to generate a DNA profile of the person who smoked that cigarette, said DNA profile didn't correlate with any existing data from law enforcement agencies in the U.S., possibly because the person it belonged to had no prior felony convictions on record. In 2019, Detective Lieutenant James Tribb took a new approach to the case and assembled a team of detectives, technicians, and experts instead of relying on just one detective as per departmental protocol. He wanted to treat this case as if it had just happened in order to account for any crucial details that may have slipped through the cracks previously. To further their investigation, the team analyzed the cigarette butt using genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy combines modern genetic genealogy techniques such as DNA profiling with the more traditional genealogical methods. It makes it possible to identify anyone as long as their profile matches that of someone else's in the nation's database. Subsequently, a specialized genetic genealogist deduced that the cigarette DNA sample had powerful correlation to William DeRoos's blood relatives on both his paternal and maternal sides. All that was needed to be 100% certain was a sample from DeRoos himself. Unfortunately, DeRoos had long passed away in 1983 in a San Francisco hotel due to a drug overdose. Undeterred by this, detectives managed to discover a living half-brother of DeRoos. They were able to obtain a DNA sample that matched the cigarette butt found at the scene. Furthermore, when analyzing Curran's torn housecoat, it became evident that the same DNA present on the cigarette was also lying there. The evidence thus presented ultimately confirmed beyond doubt that DeRoos had been in contact with both items and was therefore present at the crime scene. Police found out that DeRoos and his ex-wife had left Vermont shortly after Rita's murder and separated soon afterward. He then relocated to Thailand, where he converted to Buddhism and became a monk. When interviewed by law enforcement yet again, his ex-wife, who had changed her name and moved to Oregon, subsequently confessed that she lied about him being with her at the time of Curran's murder. Though she was likely unaware of the fact that her husband had just snatched an innocent's life, it was presumed that she, given her recently developed marital bond and affection for him, as well as knowing about his history with crime, had opted to cover for him. Additionally, it was determined that on the evening of July 19th, DeRoos had a disagreement with his wife and headed out for a stroll to cool off. The next day, he instructed his recently married wife to explain to the police officers that were probing Curran's death that he had never left her home. He cautioned her of the fact that his prior criminal record would unjustly make him a potential suspect. Burlington detectives also interviewed a woman who was married to DeRoos in 1974, and she mentioned his penchant for unexpected acts of aggression. She recalled 2 instances where he acted violently around her, one of which involved him taking out a pocket knife and stabbing an unsuspecting female friend in the abdomen without any provocation whatsoever. While he was arrested, he was ultimately let go after the victim refused to press charges for an unspecified reason. In the second incident, she was having dinner with him when DeRoos suddenly snapped, lunging at her and trying to strangle her. It was this incident that ultimately ended their relationship. Tragically, Rita's parents never got to learn the truth of her fate. At a press conference held on February 21, 2023, Rita Curran's case was finally put to rest. Her siblings expressed their immense gratitude to all the detectives who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Rita's brother, Tom Curran, had this to say: "I don't think so much about the guy who did this as I do about Rita and my parents and what they went through. I pray to my parents and I pray to Rita." Michael Sharp. On June 3, 1984, an unsuspecting 25-year-old woman awoke in her Bloomfield residence to the frightening vision of a stranger standing beside her bed. The intruder had gained entry through her home's sliding glass door. He violently clamped his hand over her mouth, menacingly warning he would shoot both her and her roommate if she dared to make a sound. He then proceeded to do unspeakable things to the helpless woman. Before leaving, the man cut off the home's phone line, rummaging through the entire house for any valuables, and even helped himself to a beer. Then, 23 days later, on June 26, 1984, a 30-year-old woman was jolted out of her sleep by the sensation of being blindfolded and bound. Her attacker barged in through the sliding door, pounced on her, and proceeded to rummage through all of her belongings. He forced her down the stairs to lead him to where her purse was located, and then proceeded to viciously assault her. The man then cut off the telecommunication lines and finished ransacking the woman's home. Before leaving, he asked her whether or not she had any good food in the fridge. Then, only 5 days later, on July 21st, 1984, a 24-year-old woman from Windsor was discovered all too late that an intruder had gained access to her apartment through the sliding door and pointed his gun at her head. She was then blindfolded and subjected to a horrible assault. The intruder then forced her into a chair, keeping her blindfolded as he searched for items of value and cash. He again disabled her phone lines in order to obstruct any attempts at communication, altered the time on her clocks, and ran water from every faucet so that his escape would be concealed by noise. Finally, on July 24th, 1984, a 24-year-old woman was lying in bed with her 2-year-old daughter at Rocky Hill when she heard an audible click from the sliding door. To her horror and shock, she saw a masked man pointing his gun directly at her face. As if she knew what was about to happen, she pleaded with him to let her move the daughter into another room. He obliged. After putting her kid to sleep, the woman was escorted back to her bedroom, where she was met with the same fate as all the other victims. For years, investigators intently searched and questioned hundreds of potential suspects, from salespeople to employees, visitors near the crime scenes, and people that regularly traveled along Interstate 91 and Route 9 close to the victims' dwellings, but came up empty-handed. Decades came and went, and the case grew cold. The police assumed a single criminal was behind the 4 crimes due to the suspect's similar speech and demeanor, as well as the proximity of each crime scene near I-91 and Route 9. In April 2003, forensic analysis confirmed this suspicion when it revealed that all 4 assaults were connected to one DNA sample. For years, no DNA matches could be found. However, in 2020, all of the victims were contacted with news that shocked them to their very core. The elusive predator, who had forever changed their lives but whom they never seen, now had a name and a face they both feared and dreaded. Police had resorted to using an entity that wasn't affiliated with law enforcement in order to finally solve this mystery and tied the DNA profile to an individual. This individual's name was Michael Sharp. Sharp, a resident of Marlboro, previously served as the CEO of an organization overseeing Jamoke Academy, a tuition-free charter school in Hartford. After being pinpointed as a suspect by utilizing publicly available genealogy data, Sharp was tracked down and his DNA was first obtained from trash left outside his home, then from one of his cheeks. These samples matched genetic material gathered in connection to all 4 crime scenes. On November 2020, 69-year-old Michael Marion Sharp of Marlboro, Connecticut, was taken into custody. In November 2022, Sharp was convicted and declared guilty of 4 counts of first-degree kidnapping, as well as 4 accounts of first-degree kidnapping committed in the course of a felony. Unfortunately, because the statute of limitations had expired by 1989, he could not be prosecuted for sexual assault. During his trial, all 4 of his victims, who elected to remain anonymous, testified against him. 3 of the women attended in person, while the 4th took part via video conference. Forensic specialists were also present, and they informed the jury that the probability of the DNA sample belonging to anyone else aside from Sharp was 1 in 7 billion. Sharp, who struggled to display any form of emotion during his sentencing, maintained his innocence throughout the trial and claimed to have forgotten parts of his life, particularly the 1980s when these kidnappings took place. He asserted that he had no recollection of committing these monstrous acts. "I just don't know how I could have possibly done something so monstrous." Family members of Sharp also spoke up in court, imploring the judge for leniency. On January 2023, in a Hartford courtroom, 71-year-old Michael Sharp was sentenced to 72 years. Judge Frank M. Diodabo, who handed down the sentence, imposed a minimum of 40 years behind bars. "You fit that definition of a person who ruthlessly exploit others," the judge told him. The judge compared the pain Sharp's victims endured to lifelong sentences and described Sharp as a vicious predator. "We are thankful that these 4 victims finally have some sense of closure. Today's sentencing sends a message to all the victims and families out there that the division's cold case unit will never stop looking for justice for them as well," said Supervisory Assistant State's Attorney John F. Fahey, head of the cold case unit who prosecuted the case. Opal Wieland. In 1987, Opal Wieland, aged 82 at the time, was a resident of Pinellas County, Florida. Opal was a well-loved figure among her neighbors, who twice daily could observe her strolling around the area on her routine morning walks. She would also be frequently visited by an entourage of family members and friends who dropped by every now and then to make sure she was doing okay. On the morning of February 9th, 1987, her sister-in-law tried to call her, as she usually did, but Opal did not pick up. Believing Opal had gone out for a routine walk, the sister-in-law kept calling every few minutes, but to no avail. Alarmed, Opal's sister-in-law went to her home and attempted to rouse her with knocks on the door. No answer. Growing more worried by the minute, she went around the back of Opal's house, where she noticed that the kitchen light was still lit, a habit not typical for Opal, who always turned it off once she got up. The sister-in-law then discovered a window pane had been taken off of the door leading up to Opal's room. It was propped up against an outer wall. When the sister-in-law entered, she made a heartbreaking discovery. Wieland was lying motionless in her bedroom with blood around her lips and bruising all over her face. As investigators probed the scene, they uncovered that a ground wire in the phone line had been severed. No fingerprints were found on the door window pane, yet there were signs of cloth or leather gloves having been used. A belt was found on the floor near her foot. A knife was also found with the tip broken and missing on the bedroom floor. It was quickly determined that the home had been ransacked. Several drawers had been searched through hastily, and Opal's jewelry box was left ajar. Her family reported the disappearance of 3 precious items, notably 2 wedding rings and a watch. After forensic experts located hairs belonging to the presumed perpetrator of the crime, they were able to obtain a partial DNA profile. Unfortunately, this was insufficient for them to definitively identify the culprit, as at the time, the DNA did not match any entries in law enforcement's records. In December 2020, more than 30 years after Opal's untimely death, cold case detectives requested that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and Parabon Nanolabs conduct another round of testing. With Parabon's help, policemen narrowed down the list of potential suspects to 3 brothers. One of the brothers was deceased. The other was swiftly ruled out. All that remained was Mississippi resident Michael Lapnewski. Lapnewski lived less than half a mile from Opal at the time of the crime in 1987. Aiming to establish a forensic connection, detectives initiated an undercover mission, gathering red coffee straws and a spoon that had been left behind by Lapnewski. Both tested positive for DNA, which corresponded to the profile found on the hairs in Will's house. Officers were able to acquire said spoon thanks to the assistance of a Bay Street Lewis detective who owned a local restaurant and knew Michael personally. As part of the scheme, he organized a local advertising campaign offering complimentary meals. A flyer was put on Lapnewski's car in hopes of attracting his attention. The plan worked. Lapnewski was drawn to the restaurant, and officers were able to acquire the utensils used by him for testing. The DNA from the straws and spoon was an exact match to the tufts of hair discovered on Opal's nightgown and bed sheets. On January 26, 2023, justice was finally served. 56-year-old Michael Lapnewski Jr. was taken into custody in Mississippi and extradited to Pinellas County, where he is being charged with first-degree murder. During his conversation with investigators, Lapnewski denied ever being close to Opal's residence during the time period in which she died. Additionally, he maintained he had never laid eyes on her, engaged in any kind of dialogue with her, nor had he ever stepped foot inside her house. Detectives believe he could be linked to other cold cases in the area. In an interview, Opal's great-niece had this to say: "After 36 years, he's been able to walk this earth. He's been able to breathe air, something my aunt didn't get the luxury of doing, and I hope that he's man enough to stand up and confess to what he's done." Mary Frances Bromsick Pryor. Mary Pryor and her husband lived in Flint, Michigan for many years. She was a member of St. Mary Queen of Angels Catholic Church, Daughters of Elizabeth, and was a leader in Girl Scouts. She ran the candy store together with her husband before ultimately deciding to put it up for sale and retire. They then relocated to Lynn, Michigan. Unfortunately, her husband passed away in 1990. Despite the loss of her husband, Mary refused to give in to despair and planted herself firmly in the comforting confines of their town. As a devout Catholic, she would regularly attend all sorts of religious events, festivals, and gatherings. Lynn's local residents also recall seeing her make the trek from her home to the local diner on an almost daily basis. On February 27, 1997, at approximately 12 p.m., Pryor's brother-in-law came to visit her when he noticed that her door was left wide open and her pet dog, who usually accompanied her on walks, was still inside. With no sign of Mary in sight, the brother-in-law decided to contact authorities and report her missing. Michigan State Police K-9 teams were dispatched and began their search. It wouldn't take long for tragedy to unfold, however. A mere 2 hours after she went missing, a trooper and his K-9 partner came upon Mary's body. It was concealed by a blanket. Pryor's body was found at the intersection of Lennon Road and M13. Community members rallied after Pryor's murder, putting together a $20,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction of the responsible person or persons. In pursuit of evidence, investigators collected DNA samples, which they believe to have belonged to Mary's assailant from the crime scene. After conducting hundreds of interviews and following up on dozens of leads, detectives eventually zeroed in on a suspect, a 17-year-old 11th grader by the name of Michael Burr. He lived just a few doors away from Mary's home. Burr was brought in for questioning. However, there wasn't enough evidence at the time to warrant any charges, as DNA technology at the time had not yet advanced enough to successfully determine if it matched what was discovered at the scene of the crime. As a result, investigators were forced to let him go, but not before taking a DNA sample of his to be stored just in case anything changes. As the years went by, Pryor's case grew cold. In 2002, Captain Chris Swanson of the Genesee County Sheriff's Office was assigned Pryor's case. In a united effort, the Genesee County Police Department and Michigan State Police Crime Lab partnered up to bring closure to the case. Subsequently, in November of 2021, a breakthrough was achieved. Scientists were able to match the DNA found at the scene to that of Michael Burr. Burr was arrested in December of that same year. Investigators were now 100% certain Michael Burr was their guy. As a matter of fact, prosecutors would state that there was only a 1 in 1.9 octillion chance Michael Burr wasn't the man who killed Mary Pryor. That's 26 zeros for that guy, Swanson said. Michael Burr was incarcerated in the Genesee County Jail. On 24th November 2021, the Genesee County District Court conducted a probable cause hearing where prosecutors presented their case against him. Burr was charged with 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and 1 count of second-degree murder. On December 5th, 2022, Burr pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree criminal sexual conduct. His kidnapping charge was dropped. Chris Swanson, who was now Genesee County Sheriff, had this to say: "I had this case assigned to me 21 years ago, and it took me across the country, following up leads and interviews and dead ends, and you just got to stay with it." The case was wrapped up on February 3, 2023, when the judge sentenced 34-year-old Michael Burr to 10 to 20 years in prison for both his second-degree murder and first-degree criminal sexual conduct charge, with the sentences running concurrently. In addition, the court mandated that he must remain on electronic monitoring for life and be registered as a sex offender. Martha Marie Morrison. Martha Marie Morrison was raised in the foster care system of Lane County, Oregon, a county just outside Eugene. Reba, her sister, recounts that their mother was hearing impaired and that Martha had an aptitude for sign language. Martha's past was marred with drug abuse, and she would often run away from her home. Sometimes it would take days before she showed up again. In September 1974, 17-year-old Martha vanished without a trace. Before her disappearance, Martha was last seen leaving her rented apartment, which she and a man she was dating had paid for. Allegedly, an argument between the couple ensued shortly before going missing. On October 12, 1974, the bodies of 2 women were discovered in Dole Valley close to Vancouver. While one was quickly identified as Carol Platt Valenzuela, the other woman's remains could not be identified. After careful inspection, it was determined that the victims had been dead for at least 2 weeks. Authorities were almost certain they were murdered. After the 2 women's remains were found, their bones were examined in a desperate attempt to uncover their identities. Through Carol Platt Valenzuela's dental records, authorities were able to swiftly identify the 18-year-old as one of the victims. Unfortunately, they could not ascertain the identity of the second victim because her dental records were unknown. On August 4, 1974, Valenzuela's husband had reported her missing after she had gone hitchhiking to Vancouver 2 days prior and did not return home. It was the investigators' wish that by identifying her, they could enhance their chances of discovering who the second body belonged to. After Valenzuela was identified, the police sought to interrogate her husband. However, he was in a critical health state at the time due to having overdosed on aspirin. The husband was eventually placed under arrest and, after successfully passing a polygraph test on October 25th, he was released from custody. Despite thorough investigations, the identity of the second victim, estimated to be between 20 and 25 years old, could not be ascertained. After an anthropologist from the University of Washington reviewed the remains, forensic facial reconstructions were created of the victim and distributed to a newspaper. Unfortunately, despite nationwide exposure, no one was able to recognize her. The victim also bore physical characteristics such as curly hair and dental hygiene issues, which were mentioned in the listing. Interestingly enough, she appeared to have previously borne a child. However, whether Morrison ever had any offspring remains unknown. After the initial investigation, police returned to the site of discovery in hopes of gathering further evidence. They even employed a metal detector borrowed from a Snohomish County resident. In the end, police had very little to work with. No DNA profile could be developed at the time, and serial killers such as Gary Ridgway and Ted Bundy were thought of as potential suspects, yet solid proof eluded authorities. After 38 years of dead ends, hope for Martha's case was finally rekindled in 2012 when forensic scientists were, at last, able to create a DNA profile from the unidentified Jane Doe's remains. DNA samples were taken from Martha's sister and half-brother to create a genetic profile that could be compared to potential matches. Upon completion of the profile, the results were compared to those of the unidentified remains. While some form of resemblance was observed, a conclusive match could not be established. Morrison and the unnamed victim were both added to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, which specializes in the finding and identification of missing individuals. Over the next 3 years, 10 missing persons were eliminated as potential identities of the remains until an identification was finally made in July 2015. Apparently, the reason it took this long is that, while in storage, the Jane Doe skull and some of her bones were mistakenly labeled as belonging to Carol Valenzuela. In 2011, discrepancies between Valenzuela's dental records and the skull's teeth revealed this issue. In a final effort to solve Martha's case, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children decided to fund an exhumation and DNA test on her father. The results were conclusive. The remains found did, with a less than a 0.000002% margin for error, belong to Martha Morrison. The puzzle was solved. Now, the only question on everyone's mind was, who was the person responsible for Martha and Carol's death? Investigators already had a suspect in mind: serial killer Warren Leslie Forrest. Forrest is currently detained for the homicide of Christy K. Blake in July 1974. He was apprehended on October 2, 1974, just 10 days prior to the discovery of Martha Morrison and Carol Platt Valenzuela's remains. In 2019, law enforcement officials performed DNA testing on a blood sample discovered on an air pistol owned by Forrest. The pistol previously belonged to a woman, one of the 6 victims that he brutalized in the years before his capture. The DNA test results confirmed that it was Martha's blood on Forrest's gun. The results also showed that he had not only likely murdered Morrison, but also Valenzuela, as the 2 women were found next to each other. Forrest is also considered a potential suspect in 2 other cases: the 1971 and 1974 disappearance of Jamie Grissom and Diane Gilchrist, respectively. On February 1st, 2023, Forrest's trial concluded with a guilty verdict on all of the charges brought against him. Prosecutor Lauren Boyd of Clark County reported that the DNA evidence, along with Forrest's history of abducting, abusing, and discarding young women in rural Clark County during the 1970s, was compelling enough to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he planned and executed Morrison's murder. On February 17, 2023, 73-year-old Warren Forrest was sentenced to life imprisonment. Warren's attorney referred to Morrison and Forrest as perfect strangers. He argued that the state failed to meet its burden of proof because there was no evidence presented indicating when or where Morrison perished, let alone how it happened. Amore Wiggins. On January 28, 2012, in Opelika, Alabama, a local stumbled upon a human skull near the Brookhaven Trailer Park on Hurst Street. After further inspection of the area, police officers discovered that there were more skeletal remains scattered about. Furthermore, a pink, long-sleeved shirt with heart-shaped buttons was located just off the creek bank. Police could not determine if this garment belonged to the victim. Detectives concluded that the skull likely belonged to a young African-American girl between 4 and 7 years old. A deformity in her left eye indicated she may have been abused, while her bones revealed signs of malnourishment and neglect. Utilizing the help of forensic artistry, an image of what the girl may have looked like was unveiled. Despite reviewing school and birth records, detectives were unable to uncover any information on her identity. Therefore, she became known as the Opelika Jane Doe. 4 years later, in 2016, a Bible school teacher from the Greater Peace Church, which was located only 10 minutes away from where the remains were discovered, uncovered photographs of a little girl who bore a striking resemblance to the Opelika Jane Doe. The teacher told police that the girl's pictures were taken in the summer of 2011 and recalled that the girl had disheveled hair, was not very hygienic, and seemed reclusive or unable to communicate with other kids. The little girl was between 4 and 5 years old at the time. The teacher could not recall her name, and the church at which she attended had failed to register any of its children, leaving no traceable records. Working with what they've got, police used advanced imaging software to enhance the old photo as much as possible, hoping that a member of the public would help them identify the Opelika Jane Doe. Then, in 2017, experts from the University of South Florida's Institute for Forensic Anthropology performed a series of isotope tests on her bones and came to the conclusion that she probably lived in the southeastern parts of the United States. In January 2022, the help of Othram Laboratories was employed by the Opelika Police Department. Othram is an advanced forensic sequencing lab built to apply the power of modern parallel sequencing to forensic evidence. Her remains were sent to Othram's laboratory. A DNA extract from these remains was then synthesized, which facilitated the creation of a more comprehensive genealogical profile. Taking matters further, the Opelika Police Department sought out the help of Barbara Ray Ventor, a renowned geneticist who was mostly known for aiding police investigations with identifying the Golden State Killer to supply investigative leads. In January 2023, Othram was finally able to uncover the identity of the Opelika Jane Doe. She was a little girl by the name of Amore Wiggins. Amore's father was known as Lamar Vickerstaff, a 50-year-old native of Opelika. Lamar was serving in the U.S. Navy. Prior to the discovery's announcements, detectives journeyed to the Mayport Naval Station in Jacksonville, where Lamar was stationed at the time, and confronted him about his daughter's passing. Lamar refused to cooperate. When questioned about the girl's remains, Ruth, Lamar's wife, to whom he'd been married since May 2006, informed detectives that she had no idea who she was or who her real mother might have been. It was later discovered that Amore's real mother was Sherry Wiggins, who hailed from Maryland. Sherry met Lamar Vickerstaff when she was only 19. Lamar was 35 and serving in the Navy at the time. The two lived in the same apartment complex. Soon after, they decided to take the next step and move in together when Sherry discovered her pregnancy. Despite this, Lamar's family was deeply angered by the fact that their son had a child out of wedlock, so the couple agreed to split up after coming to the realization that getting married wouldn't be feasible. At the age of 37, Sherry told detectives that she was indeed Amore's biological mother. She confirmed that Lamar and Ruth had received full legal custody over Amore back in 2009, that Sherry was paying child support to Lamar since then, and that her visitation rights were suspended at the time of Amore's death. Lamar and Ruth were apprehended in Jacksonville, Florida on January 17, 2023. They are currently being detained at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office and are both charged with failure to report a missing child. In addition to these charges, Lamar is also facing a felony murder charge. Sherry, Amore's real mother, spoke out publicly, expressing her feelings on the community's reaction to her daughter's case. She stated that although some have been kind and understanding of her situation, many were quick to pass judgment on her without any knowledge of what truly happened. Despite this, Sherry said the only thing she was worried about was getting justice for Amore. She extended an immense amount of gratitude towards the Opelika Police Department, who never gave up on finding her missing child. Of Deanna Denise Howland. On the spring day of May 2004, 35-year-old Deanna Denise Howland vanished without a trace. Deanna hailed from Alton, Illinois. She was a mother of 4, yet most of her children never knew her. Deanna's life leading up to her mysterious vanishing was troubled, to say the least. For years, she endured a drug addiction that caused her lifestyle to be unsettled and unpredictable. Nevertheless, one of her daughters noticed something was amiss when Deanna neglected to appear for a school play she had promised her to attend in May 2004. Then, on a fateful day in June of 2004, maintenance workers at the rest stop off Interstate 70 discovered a human body, which had been discarded down a grassy incline. The body belonged to a woman, yet some parts of her were missing. All she had on was a black bra. The lack of decomposition suggested that her death had likely been recent. Moreover, a sharp blade was found in a nearby sewer, having been discarded at the scene of the crime. Investigators tried identifying the body using what little evidence they had available to them, such as a C-section scar, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. As for who was responsible for the murder, there was only one clue. Witnesses reported that they saw a white utility van parked in the vicinity of the crime scene 24 hours prior to the discovery of the torso. With no fresh leads to go by, and with no way of figuring out the woman's identity at the time, her case went cold. Then, 12 years later, in 2016, advanced DNA testing revealed that the mysterious Jane Doe was, in fact, Deanna Howland. Subsequently, using this same technology, police were also able to discover the identity of her murderer by testing the knife which was left at the scene of the crime. It was a man by the name of Mike Clardy. Mike was apprehended in Maryland Heights at the residence he shared with his spouse. It turns out, following Deanna's murder, Mike had had a car accident that rendered him blind. Mike Clardy confessed to murdering Deanna in his home and moving her body to where it was eventually found. He mentioned that he met Deanna while she was working on the street and that his reasons for killing her in such a horrific manner were all because of a disagreement. If found guilty, he is facing up to 40 years in prison for his crime. Of Noelle Renee Trice and Brian Keith Lash. It was the morning hours of August 11, 2017, when someone stumbled upon the lifeless bodies of Noelle Renee Trice and Brian Keith Lashley in their Fort Wayne, Indiana home. Noelle was born on June 28, 1991. Brian, on the other hand, was born on the 7th of July in 1987. They were 25 and 29 years old, respectively. Officers immediately responded to the scene and found blood splattered throughout the residence. Investigators were able to determine that a party had taken place at the couple's home earlier that night after questioning family members and guests who attended. Police began analyzing the scene of the crime. Law enforcement personnel carefully examined Noelle's phone, discovered in the hallway, for any fingerprints. Unsurprisingly, Noelle's fingerprints were found all over the phone. But surprisingly, another unknown fingerprint was also discovered. Detectives worked tirelessly to find a match for the mysterious fingerprint. Initially, they suspected it may have belonged to Brian, but after running through their database, they soon discovered that the fingerprint belonged to Dustin Neal, an old acquaintance of the couple. When questioned, Dustin revealed that he had known Noelle for about 20 years, that he had gone straight to his mother's house right after the party, and, perhaps most intriguing of all, that he was aware of the couple's possession of 3 pounds of marijuana, which, according to Dustin himself, was worth a lot of money. With no evidence against him, Dustin was allowed to go home, and it seemed as though Noelle and Brian's murderer would never be found. But then, a person was tracked down who had spoken to Dustin around the time of the murders, unraveling an even bigger mystery. This individual revealed that Dustin contacted him on 10th of June, 2017. Dustin sounded on edge and claimed he had a large quantity of marijuana up for sale. In July 2022, another witness alerted police that Dustin Neal's half-brother had told him his brother was responsible for what happened to Noelle and Brian. Investigating further, authorities spoke with the half-brother in October of that same year, who confessed to hearing Dustin bragging about killing both Noelle and Brian. In October of 2022, yet another witness came forward, this time claiming that Dustin had told them that he was responsible for the deaths of Noelle, Brian, and 5 other people. During that same month, police analyzed Dustin's cell phone, and they discovered that his cell phone signals would have placed him at the scene of the crime between 6:20 a.m. and 7:04 a.m. With so much evidence now in the police possession, the truth was finally revealed. In an ill-conceived attempt to steal some marijuana, Neal entered the couple's home through a window, believing nobody was there. Unfortunately, he was then spotted by Brian. Unsure what to do, Neal lunged at Brian with the knife and murdered him. He then went on to do the same thing to Noelle. On January 1st of 2023, Fort Wayne Police Department and the Allen County Sheriff's Department charged and arrested 35-year-old Neal in Wells County. Dustin will soon be extradited to Allen County, where he will be charged with the murder of Noelle Renee Trice and Brian Keith Lashley. After nearly 6 years since this crime was committed, justice has finally been served. Of Daisy Mae Tallman. In 2008, an unidentified female's skeletal remains were discovered west of White Swan. The Yakima Coroner's Office explored all leads available to try and identify her, but had no luck with traditional DNA testing, as the bones did not provide an accurate DNA profile. With every lead run dry and no DNA results in hand, this case soon faded into obscurity. Then, in 2022, the Yakima County Coroner's Office and Othram joined forces to utilize advanced DNA testing with the aim of identifying this unknown woman. The skeletal remains were sent to Othram, where scientists were able to finally obtain a usable extract from them. Subsequently, the lab employed forensic-grade genome sequencing to construct a complete DNA profile. The Yakima County Coroner's Office conducted an investigation and provided a familiar reference DNA sample. Othram relied on state-of-the-art familiar testing technology to confirm the supposed connection between the reference sample and the unknown female's genetic material. After a thorough investigation, it was confirmed that the unidentified female was Daisy Mae Tallman, otherwise known as Daisy Mae Heath. She was born on 10th of January, 1958. Described by those who were fortunate enough to know her, Daisy was a lively and courageous young girl with an introverted personality. She treasured her kin and the old-fashioned lifestyle, never shying away from lending a hand whenever needed. Her missing persons report revealed that she had been residing with relatives in the Yakima Indian Reservation when she went missing. Later, her backpack and keys were discovered at a secluded locale called Soda Springs within the reservation's territory. Daisy disappeared during the last days of August 1987 and was not reported missing by her family until late October. The reason her family waited 2 full months before reporting her missing was that she had a habit of disappearing for days, sometimes even weeks at a time. Daisy was 29 years old at the time of her death. The exact circumstances of her passing remain unknown. Of Wilomeana Filkins. 81-year-old Wilomeana Violet Filkins was a resident of East Greenbush, New York. She loved life and spent the years following her retirement tending to her garden and doing volunteer work. Violet lived in East Greenbush for 60 years, but grew up in the neighboring town of Rensselaer, alongside 9 other siblings. She was never married and lived alone. On the 19th of August 1994, Violet's brother and niece arrived at her apartment blissfully unaware of what they were about to witness. Though her car, a 1989 Plymouth Reliant, was parked in her normal spot at the multi-building complex, the two noticed that it was parked in an unusual way, not at all how Violet typically parks. Intrigued, the two ventured inside the building complex. As soon as they went inside Violet's home, they were met with a grisly sight. It was their beloved sibling, not full of vibrancy as usual, but instead lying lifelessly on her apartment floor. An autopsy later revealed that Violet had been assaulted 2 days prior to the discovery of her body. The cause of death was determined to be trauma to the head. Law enforcement officers theorized that Violet's assailant likely confronted her during a robbery, and this hypothesis became more readily apparent after it was discovered that her car had been stolen, only to be returned on the very same day, which explains the unusual way it was parked when her brother and sister saw it. 3 years later, some of Violet's possessions were also discovered near the Nassau-Shodak Cemetery in the village of Nassau, 10 miles southeast of her apartment complex. In spite of the extensive number of leads pursued, investigators failed to pin down a likely suspect. Violet's case went cold as a result. In 2019, 25 years after the original incident occurred, investigators received a tip from a woman who said that her boyfriend had confessed to robbing an elderly woman before hitting her and leaving her to die. "That poor old woman. I robbed her, I hit her, and I just left her there." The boyfriend's name was Jeremiah James Gouvet. He was 18 at the time the crime took place. Gouvet's name was included in police documents as having been questioned regarding the murder, but was subsequently ruled out as a potential suspect. Upon graduating from high school, Gouvet moved to Red Hook, New York, where he then enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and was assigned at Patrick Air Force Base near Cape Canaveral. After being discharged from the military, he returned home to Red Hook and eventually settled in Rosendale. Gouvet was 43 at the time and had found a job working as a bus driver for elderly seniors. When law enforcement officers arrived at Gouvet's home on October 1st, 2019, and questioned him about Violet's murder, he instantly became defensive and grew visibly agitated. Furthermore, he refused to talk to anyone without an attorney present. At the same time, police also questioned Gouvet's family members, acquaintances, and colleagues. The next day, however, Gouvet was found dead. He had taken his own life. Just before his untimely death, it was reported he contacted a family member stating that he didn't want to go to jail. Gouvet sounded terrified and distress throughout the ominous phone call. Investigators then retrieved fingerprints and DNA from Gouvet for use as proof in the investigation. A comparison between Gouvet's fingerprint and another, previously unidentified fingerprint found on a wooden corner of a coffee table at the scene of the crime revealed what investigators were already suspecting. The fingerprints were one and the same. On the 19th of January, 2023, the East Greenbush Police Department convened a press conference to announce that Jeremiah James Gouvet was the man responsible for the taking of Wilomeana Filkins' life. At the news conference, Wilomeana's niece expressed great appreciation for law enforcement and remembered her aunt as a humble woman who lived peacefully and spread nothing but joy and kindness to all those around her. Dorothy Lynn Ricker. On October 27, 1997, the Michigan State Police received a call about a body of an unclothed woman who had washed up on shore near Fox Farm Road in Manistee County. When they arrived at the scene, they discovered that she was already deceased for some time. At the time of discovery, the only physical identifier this woman had on her was a single earring. An autopsy later revealed that her death was due to asphyxia via drowning and determined it was probably accidental. Due to the limited technology at the time, nobody could figure out with certainty who the woman was. But in September 2020, the Michigan State Police Cadillac Post and Missing Persons Coordination Unit decided to reopen the investigation due to the availability of more advanced DNA testing techniques. As a result, the woman's body was exhumed and brought to a lab for further examination. Police officials sought the help of a DNA Dope Project, a nonprofit that assists in providing closures for families and investigators by leveraging investigative genetic genealogy. In July 2021, a potential familiar association was identified through the use of this technology. The findings were then supplied by the DNA Dope Project to Michigan State Police, who conducted further investigations. After looking at all the evidence, authorities determined a potential link between the woman's remains and the Thing family who lived in Acton, Maine. Subsequently, Michigan State Police secured familiar DNA reference samples from a potential relative. Unfortunately, the bone samples taken from the woman's remains were not suitable for traditional testing due to their deteriorated state. Therefore, they were submitted to Intermountain Forensics in Salt Lake City, Utah, and with advanced next-generation sequencing, a positive identification was reached on December 2022. The remains were identified as those of Dorothy Lynn Ricker, a 26-year-old woman who had been living in Chicago before she vanished. Dorothy was last seen on October 2, 1997, at 12:30 p.m., when officers from the St. Francis Police Department in Wisconsin encountered her sitting on a beach near the lake and spoke with her. Officers recalled she told them that she was enjoying the lakefront and the sun. Dorothy wasn't registered as missing at the time, so officers didn't think much of it. Dorothy's car was found abandoned shortly after she was last seen. Whether Dorothy took her own life or whether there was some form of foul play remains a mystery to this day. Of Daniel G. Garza-Gonzales. On March 13, 1973, a shocking discovery was made on the banks of Saginaw River in Milwaukee, Michigan. A man's body had been unceremoniously cast out into the waters. Autopsy reports showed that he had sustained multiple gunshot wounds and injuries caused by blunt force trauma. It appeared someone had hit him on the back of his head before shooting and throwing away his body, leaving behind no trace. With no clues as to whom the culprit could be, authorities laid the man's body in an unmarked grave, and the case went cold for almost 50 years. However, in 2020, the Michigan State Police Cold Case Team and their Missing Persons Coordination Unit reopened the case. They exhumed the body for advanced DNA testing and sent a bone sample to Australia Forensics for forensics genetic genealogy. In late 2021, with help from the nonprofit DNA Project, Inc., they identified a possible familiar match. With collaboration between the Texas Rangers and the DNA Project, they were able to link the remains to a family in Beeville, Texas, and obtain familiar DNA reference samples, which were sent to an FBI lab for comparison. On January 5th of 2023, it was announced that the John Doe in question had been identified as Vietnam War veteran Daniel G Garza-Gonzales, who was only 28 years old at the time of his disappearance. Following his return to America, he had left Fort Worth, Texas in search of work in Flint, Michigan, but never made it there or back home again. Daniel's killer remains unknown. The Michigan State Police Cold Case Team and Missing Persons Coordination Unit is still calling for anyone with information on Daniel's case to come forward. Of Lillian DeCloe. 89 years old, Lillian DeCloe was a former teacher and nurse who lived in Broward County in 1994. She suffered from memory loss and needed assistance with day-to-day activities. Her niece, June Nicholas, took care of her. On the afternoon of April 29, 1994, June entered her aunt's home only to find Lillian had been murdered. It appeared as though the assailant had gotten into the house through a bedroom window and ransacked the place, indicating it was likely not a targeted attack, but rather a robbery gone wrong. In an effort to gather more information, the police diligently collected various objects from the crime scene as evidence. Years later, in 2004, detectives at Broward County Sheriff's Office retested Lillian's nightgown and discovered male DNA on it. Hoping to solve the case, Broward County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation in 2019. They examined previous records and DNA databases, combing them for any potential leads that may have missed. In the end, they found a likely suspect, a homeless man by the name of Johnny Mac Brown. Johnny Mac Brown was a former United States Marine who once lived just down the street from Lillian. His family members shared with detectives that he had been suffering from substance abuse and PTSD for a number of years, something which eventually led up to his death in 2010. In August 2022, investigators obtained a court order to unearth Brown's remains from the South Florida National Cemetery in Palm Beach County. Tests conducted by the Broward County Sheriff's Office Crime Lab revealed that Brown's DNA was a direct match with the DNA left on Lillian's nightgown. The truth was finally revealed. Johnny Mac Brown was responsible for what happened to Lillian. Lillian's case was now solved. When June Nicholas found out who her aunt killers was, she had this to say: "I know that wherever she is, she can sleep in peace." Of Philip Kahn. On July 24, 2000, an unidentified male body was discovered floating in the Atlantic Ocean, 27 miles off the coast of Maine, near the Grand Manan Banks. In an effort to identify this man, the Maine Office of Chief Medical Examiner performed an autopsy and took DNA and fingerprint samples. The samples were submitted to the FBI, yet no matches were found. Despite their best efforts, no new leads were unearthed by the police and the case went cold. In 2019, the Maine Office of Chief Medical Examiner enlisted the help of Parabon Nanolabs to evaluate the DNA and attempt forensic genealogy, hoping to uncover any potential leads. Unfortunately, their efforts yielded no tangible results. In March 2022, the Maine Office of Chief Medical Examiner held a meeting with representatives from the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services to discuss modernized technologies available through their organization. The unidentified man's fingerprints and dental records were sent for analysis in May 2022. After review by DPI services and further examination at the FBI, it was determined that the remains belonged to 84-year-old Philip Kahn, who had gone missing in Las Vegas in 2000. One of Philip's family members was notified of the disturbing finding. Philip had left Las Vegas, Nevada in July 2020 and landed in New York. How his body ended up off the coast of Maine is a puzzle yet to be solved. William and Ina Campbell. William and Ina Campbell were a loving, elderly couple, both in their 80s, who lived on Jackson Road, Clarksville, Tennessee. During a heavy snowstorm in 2010, the couple's mailbox was struck by an unfortunate neighbor driving on the slippery roads. The neighbor tried calling several times, but William Campbell was not answering his phone, so the neighbor tried calling Daniel Champagne. Daniel was also their neighbor, but was very close to the Campbells. In fact, the Campbells thought of him as a son and even entrusted him with a spare set of keys to their house. Daniel attempted to reach out to the couple, yet there was no response. With no other option, he felt that he had no other recourse but to use the key he'd been given to gain entrance into their home and check if everything was okay. When he entered the house, he was greeted by an appalling sight. William and Ina Campbell lay on their beds. They had been murdered in their sleep. As they aged, the Campbells endured a few medical issues which necessitated them sleeping in separate beds. When Daniel discovered Ina, she still had her oxygen tube attached to her nose. After the shock wore out and he slowly began grasping the reality of what he saw, Daniel looked around him and noticed that the drawers were all ripped apart and all of the kitchen cupboards were left hanging open, indicating that the place had been ransacked. What was most peculiar of all is that none of the Campbells' guns were taken. According to the Clarksville police detective Tim Anderson, guns are the number one thing that gets stolen during a robbery. Immediately, Daniel informed the police, who promptly arrived on the scene and began analyzing all the evidence. Some of the neighbors were questioned and recalled that the dogs never barked. This was strange, as the Campbells' dogs definitely would bark if a stranger walked inside the home unannounced. This led officers to surmise that it was someone who was well acquainted with the victims and their dogs who had committed the crime. What investigators found most bizarre was that no items of value were taken. Jewelry boxes remained untouched, the safe had not been tampered with, and all of the money the Campbells had lying around was still there when police arrived. All of this led officers to conclude that the person behind the crime must have had ulterior motives, that he stood to gain something more substantial than a few pieces of expensive jewelry and a few $100s. Their adopted son, William Roger Campbell, immediately became a person of interest, as he was next in line to inherit their estate if they were to pass away. Bill Campbell's estate was valued at $130,000, and Ina's estate was worth approximately $120,000. Investigators also recalled that Roger refused to cooperate with them fully and even provided several inconsistencies during questioning. Furthermore, he was declared the last known person to see his parents alive. Despite all of that, at the time, there wasn't enough evidence linking him to the scene of the crime. As time passed and leads ran thin, interest in the case slowly fizzled out. Then 11 years later, on June 21, 2021, Roger Campbell was apprehended at his home by deputies from the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office in what must have been an unexpected turn of events for him, and extradited to Clarksville. His bond was set at $500,000. He was charged with the murder of his adoptive parents, but Roger maintained his innocence, pleading not guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. What he failed to take into consideration was that detectives were hard at work gathering up all the evidence necessary for constructing a solid case against him. His trial began on January 2023. During the trial, prosecutors showcased what detectives have managed to unearth throughout the years, and Roger's prospects for a not guilty verdict slowly began diminishing. It was revealed that only a few days after the Campbells' remains were found, law enforcement officers traveled to Georgia in order to question him, and in his truck, they noticed an ominously red-stained sheet tucked away beneath one of its seats. Although testing could not determine whether or not it was actually blood, detectives also discovered traces of Roger's blood found on the surface of a dish soap bottle near the kitchen sink. His upstairs bathroom sink drain was also looked at, and it tested positive for blood. Roger Campbell's ex-wife and son both took to the stand and testified against him. William Sean Campbell, the 35-year-old son of Roger Campbell, fondly remembered having a close bond with his late grandparents. As for his father, he only saw him on very rare occasions throughout his childhood. "I've been on this earth 35 years, and in that 35 years, I've spent less than 24 hours around him." Sean Campbell also revealed that shortly after his grandparents' funeral, he learned of an estate auction taking place at their residence. He felt betrayed because his father never reached out to him about keeping any mementos from his grandparents. As for 70-year-old Linda Campbell, Roger's former spouse, she testified in court that 3 days before the Campbells were discovered dead, she worked at the commissary and was paged to register 17, only to see Roger there alongside one of his would-be victims, his mother, Ina Campbell. Before then, Linda hadn't seen or even spoken to Roger for 13 years. He seemed a bit too eager to strike up a conversation with her, only to cut it short after making it explicitly clear that he was only in town for a short while and will be leaving on the 28th of January, which, as fate would have it, was the very same day the Campbells met their gruesome fate. I thought, why do I care when you're leaving? It seemed as if Roger's real motive was to devise an alibi. After examining the crime scene, detectives uncovered two .25 caliber shell casings in the victim's room that were linked to one particular firearm. Interestingly enough, only one casing matched a box of ammunition found at the site. The box belonged to the late Bill Campbell. According to Andrew Smith, the proprietor of It's Time Clock Shop, the Campbells owned a very rare Lynskritch grandfather clock. Smith testified that he had been regularly maintaining the Campbell's clock for several years, visiting their residence yearly to make repairs. When Smith saw the clock, he offered Bill Campbell $5,000 for it, as fate would have it, in front of Roger. Bill, however, knew the timepiece was a prized antique, so he refused to part with it. Smith recalled that, in the days following the tragedy, he received a phone call inquiring if he was still interested in purchasing the Lynskritch grandfather clock. Excitedly, he agreed and was given directions on where to go and inspect it. When Smith got to the Campbells' household, he let the courtroom know how thrilled he was to finally be able to purchase the clock. Unfortunately, instead of his frequent patrons, it was Roger, their adopted son, who greeted him. I said, "Where's your mom and dad?" He seemed nervous, shaky, and said, "Didn't you hear? Mom and Dad were shot and killed in the bedrooms." Without hesitation, Smith attempted to put a halt to the sale. However, Roger tried reassuring him, insisting that he was their only heir and that he can do whatever he pleased with his parents' belongings. Smith was eventually convinced and decided to go ahead with the transaction. What Smith found most bizarre was that Roger seemed overly unfazed by his parents' brutal demise, as he tried his luck by bargaining for $6,000 instead of $5,000, an attempt that ultimately failed. In the end, Roger agreed to part with his father's clock for only $5,000. Roger's previous testimony also came back to haunt him. He reported to detectives that he had left his parents' home at about 7 a.m. on January 28, 2010, noting that they were still wearing their nightwear when he set off. Forensic specialists determined the time of death was somewhere around 6:20 a.m. prior to Roger's departure from the premises. All in all, prosecutors argued that Roger Campbell was clearly a man influenced by greed. They showcased just how much Roger had financially profited from the crime. They weren't dying fast enough, said Assistant District Attorney Crystal Morgan. That's why he killed them. He needed money, and they weren't dying quick enough. On January 23, 2023, 66-year-old William Roger Campbell was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. If you have found this interesting, then be sure to subscribe because you don't want to miss what is coming next. As always, thanks for watching.